Imagine waking up one day with the unsettling sense that your life is looping. Different faces, different years, different circumstances, yet the same outcomes keep arriving at your door. The same arguments, just with new voices. The same promises to yourself, broken in familiar ways. The same regret, wearing a slightly different mask. You look back and wonder how it's possible to be so self-aware, so intelligent, so determined, yet still trapped in patterns you swore you had outgrown. You tell yourself this time is different. You meant it every other time too. Here's the paradox that quietly haunts you. You don't repeat mistakes because you don't know better. You repeat them because some part of you believes they are necessary. Comforting, even. There is a strange familiarity in failure when it arrives on predictable terms. Chaos is frightening, but unknown success can be even more terrifying. At least the pain you recognize lets you brace for impact. So you rationalize. You reframe. You blame timing, other people, bad luck, the economy, your childhood, your temperament. Anything but the one thought that feels too dangerous to linger on for long. That the pattern is not happening to you, but through you. Why do you keep choosing what hurts you, even when you swear you want peace? Why do you keep walking toward doors that have already proven to be locked? Why does insight feel so sharp, yet transformation remains so elusive? Perhaps the most disturbing question of all is this: what if your mistakes are not accidents? What if they are messages you've learned to ignore? What if each repetition is not a failure of willpower, but a signal from a deeper layer of your mind? One that doesn't speak in words, but in compulsions. You may have noticed how change feels deceptively close. You read the books. You watch the videos. You understand the theories. You can explain your problems better than most people can. Yet when the moment arrives, the choice, the impulse, the split second where everything could shift, you default. Almost automatically, as if something older than logic takes the wheel. And that's the most unsettling realization. Repetition doesn't require conscious consent. It only requires silence. Silence where there should have been confrontation. Silence where there should have been reflection. Silence where the uncomfortable truth waited patiently to be named. The mind has a way of protecting what it believes keeps you alive, even if that protection slowly destroys you. Until you understand why the pattern exists, breaking it will feel like betrayal, not of others but of yourself. And this is where the real problem begins, not on the surface of your choices but far beneath them, in a psychological and philosophical terrain most people never dare to explore. The pattern persists because it was never created at the level where you keep trying to fix it. You aim your efforts at behavior, discipline, and motivation, while the real architect of repetition lives deeper, beneath language, beneath reason, beneath the part of you that believes it is in control. This is where psychology becomes unsettling and philosophy turns uncomfortable. Carl Jung called it the shadow. The parts of yourself you learned were unacceptable, unsafe, or unlovable. Traits you buried not because they were evil, but because they threatened belonging. The shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It waits. And when it waits long enough, it begins to act for you. Not loudly, not dramatically, but through habits, impulses, and choices that feel strangely inevitable. You don't repeat mistakes because you enjoy suffering. You repeat them because they allow the shadow to remain hidden. Each familiar failure preserves an old identity. Each predictable collapse protects you from asking a more dangerous question. Who would I be without this story? Friedrich Nietzsche warned that people often cling to their suffering because it gives them meaning. Pain becomes a compass. Struggle becomes identity. Without it, there is a terrifying openness, an uncharted freedom that demands responsibility. To truly change would mean letting go of the version of yourself that knows how to survive in chaos. And survival, even when miserable, feels safer than transformation. Arthur Schopenhauer took this further, arguing that much of human behavior is driven not by rational choice, but by blind will, an unconscious force endlessly seeking satisfaction yet never finding it. This is why insight alone feels powerless. You see the pattern, but the will has already moved. The decision is made before thought arrives to justify it. Modern psychology echoes this grim realization. The brain prioritizes familiarity over happiness. Neural pathways deepen through repetition, not reward. What you do most often becomes what feels most natural, even when it hurts. Over time, the mind confuses the known with the safe. This is why the same relationships, the same mistakes, the same emotional outcomes keep resurfacing under different disguises. Jean-Paul Sartre would say this is bad faith. The subtle lie you tell yourself to avoid the weight of freedom. It's easier to say, "This is just who I am," than to admit, "I am choosing this again." Choice implies responsibility. Responsibility implies anxiety. And anxiety is something the mind will do almost anything to escape. So the cycle continues. Not because you are broken, but because a part of you is trying to protect you from an existential threat you barely recognize. The repetition is not random. It is purposeful. And until you see what it's protecting, every attempt to change will feel like pushing against an invisible wall. But walls don't just block movement. They shape the rooms you live in. And that shape has consequences, quiet at first, then overwhelming, rippling outward into every corner of your life, whether you notice them or not. The most dangerous consequences are never the loud ones. They don't arrive as sudden disasters or dramatic collapses. They seep in quietly, shaping your perception until you mistake the cage for the world itself. By the time you sense something is wrong, the pattern has already rewritten how you see yourself, others, and reality. Each repetition strengthens an invisible belief. This is all I'm capable of. Neuroscience calls it predictive coding. The brain learns from the past and uses it to anticipate the future. When the same mistakes repeat, your mind begins to expect them. And what the brain expects, it subtly steers toward. You don't just remember failure. You begin to anticipate it. Then, without realizing it, you behave in ways that confirm it. This is how self-sabotage disguises itself as fate. Cognitive biases tighten the trap. Confirmation bias filters your attention so you notice evidence that supports your old story while dismissing anything that challenges it. Negativity bias amplifies setbacks and minimizes progress. Learned helplessness creeps in, the quiet conviction that effort is pointless because outcomes never change. Over time, hope starts to feel naive. Cynicism feels intelligent. On a personal level, this erosion is devastating. You begin to distrust your own promises. Motivation feels hollow because it has betrayed you before. Even moments of opportunity trigger anxiety rather than excitement. When something good appears, you brace for loss. When something familiar appears, even if it's painful, you relax. The nervous system prefers the known rhythm of suffering to the uncertainty of peace. Society reinforces this without you noticing. Culture rewards productivity, not presence. Image, not introspection. Speed, not depth. There is little space to ask why you repeat patterns, only pressure to fix them quickly and move on. So you chase surface-level solutions while the root continues to grow. You optimize the prison instead of questioning why you're inside it. Aldous Huxley warned that the most effective control is the one people don't recognize as control. Repetition works the same way. You believe you are choosing freely, while unseen conditioning narrows the range of choices you even consider. Eventually, entire futures disappear from imagination, not because they are impossible, but because they no longer feel realistic. The most tragic consequence is not failure. It is resignation. You stop asking the deeper questions. You stop expecting more from yourself. You begin to live as a reduced version of what you sense you could be. And because this reduction happens gradually, it feels natural, almost reasonable. But beneath that reasonableness, something restless remains. A quiet discomfort. A sense that life is being lived on repeat while something essential goes untouched. That discomfort is not your enemy. It is the last signal that the pattern hasn't won yet. And it is here, precisely where resignation begins, that rebellion becomes possible. Not a loud rebellion. Not a dramatic one, a psychological one. Real rebellion does not begin with action. It begins with perception. The moment you stop asking, how do I fix this? And start asking, what is this pattern protecting me from? Something shifts. You are no longer at war with yourself. You are investigating yourself. An investigation, unlike force, doesn't trigger resistance. This is the counterintuitive truth. The pattern will not release you until it feels understood. The mind does not abandon defenses simply because they are inefficient. It abandons them only when they are no longer necessary. Viktor Frankl observed that when people find meaning in their suffering, the suffering loses its grip. Not because pain disappears, but because it no longer needs to speak through repetition. So the rebellion begins with radical honesty. Not the performative kind, but the kind that makes you uncomfortable. You ask yourself what you secretly gain from repeating the mistake. Tension, familiarity, a reason not to risk something greater, a way to confirm a belief you've carried since childhood. The answer will not flatter you. That's how you know you're close. Instead of trying to stop the behavior, you slow it down. You watch it arise. You notice the bodily sensations before the choice, the tightening chest, the restless urgency, the familiar emotional gravity pulling you toward the old outcome. This interrupts automation. The nervous system can't run a program that's being observed in real time. Philosophically, this is where Nietzsche's idea of self-overcoming becomes practical. Not domination, not suppression, integration. You don't destroy the part of you that repeats the mistake. You listen to it. You let it speak its fear fully without arguing back. Paradoxically, this is what weakens it. History is filled with people who broke free not by changing circumstances, but by changing their relationship to them. Prisoners who discovered inner freedom. Artists who transformed wounds into vision. Thinkers who turned despair into clarity. They didn't escape repetition by denying it. They escaped by outgrowing it. Practically, this means choosing discomfort over familiarity in small, deliberate ways. Saying no where you'd normally say yes. Pausing where you'd normally rush. Allowing silence where you'd normally distract yourself. These are not dramatic acts, but they are revolutionary to a system built on unconscious repetition. Each time you resist the urge to resolve discomfort the old way, you carve a new neural path. The brain begins to learn a new prediction. Maybe something else is possible. Not guaranteed, just possible. And possibility is enough to destabilize a pattern that relies on inevitability. You don't break free all at once. You loosen the grip. The repetition weakens not because you fought it, but because you no longer need what it offers. And when that need dissolves, a deeper truth begins to surface, one that reframes your entire past, not as a series of failures, but as preparation for a realization that changes everything. That realization is the final threshold. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here is the truth that rearranges everything once it's seen clearly. You were never repeating mistakes because you were weak, unaware, or incapable of change. You were repeating them because your psyche was trying to finish something unfinished. The pattern was not your enemy. It was your teacher, one that refused to leave until the lesson was fully integrated. Every repetition was an initiation. The mind does not heal in straight lines. It circles. It returns. It reenacts, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. What remains unconscious does not disappear. It seeks expression. Until you consciously claim the fear, belief, or identity embedded in the pattern, life will continue placing you in variations of the same classroom. Jung once said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This is the moment where fate dissolves. Not because life becomes predictable, but because you finally see how much of it was being lived on autopilot. The deepest realization is this: the part of you that kept repeating the mistake was once the part that kept you alive. At some point, often early, often invisibly, you learned a strategy that worked. It reduced pain, preserved belonging. It gave you control in a world that felt overwhelming. That strategy became identity. An identity, once formed, resists its own expiration. Even when it becomes outdated, even when it begins to cost more than it protects. Freedom does not come from erasing that identity. It comes from thanking it and then letting it rest. When you see this, guilt loses its grip. Shame dissolves. The past reorganizes itself, no longer as evidence of failure, but as proof of endurance. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What am I finally ready to release?" This is where repetition ends, not with force but with closure. And here is the paradoxical ending few people reach. Once the lesson is learned, the pattern no longer needs to return. Not because you are constantly vigilant, but because the inner conflict that summoned it has resolved. The nervous system relaxes. The mind widens its sense of what's possible. Choices that once felt impossible begin to feel neutral, ordinary, available. You don't become a new person. You become a more complete one. And from that completeness, something quietly radical emerges. Responsibility without fear. Freedom without chaos. Meaning without suffering as proof. So the next time you feel the pull of an old mistake, pause, not with panic, but with curiosity. Ask what it's asking you to finally see. Because once you truly see it, the loop breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently.